Welcome back to Conversations. I'm Bill Kristol. Very pleased to be joined today, Sunday, November, 8th, right after the 2020 election, by my friend Ron Brownstein, one of the really stellar analysts of not just elections, but American politics more broadly, author of several books, which I highly recommend, senior editor at The Atlantic, a senior analyst on CNN, and we were just talking before we came on air here, author of a forthcoming book, which you've just got in the galleys of, is that right? Or
I wish, almost.
What's the book on? Tell people.
It's called Rock Me on the Water, and it's a history of politics and culture in early 1970s LA, which I argue is the moment when the 60s critique of American life was cemented into pop culture. And it happened in television, movies, and music, basically here in a short time, within a few blocks of each other.
Wow. Well, that will be a good discussion that will be slightly different from our election-focused analysis of.
Although similar in the sense of the generational change was reflected in the culture before it was in the politics, which I think is what we're living through now. And that was kind of what inspired me to, in some ways, to do that book, to tackle that subject.
That sounds great. Okay, so much to talk about. When you were on, we've done 3 of these conversations, and the last one was just after the election in November 2018, so 2 years ago, in which you semi-predicted, but mostly predicted that the Democratic ticket could likely be Joe Biden and Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
In which you said you thought it likely the blue wall, which was I think your term from a decade earlier.
2009, yeah.
2009, the blue wall of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania could be reestablished in the 2020 election. So those are 2 good predictions. Maybe we should retire now. It's now
really?
anything we say now is gonna it's just downhill from here.
Yeah, because I certainly got some things wrong this year, so I'm happy to talk about that.
Okay, we'll talk about that too. So let's just begin with a sort of simple but question I think will open up a lot of broad questions, which is Joe Biden the only Democrat who could have won this year in 2020?
I really think so. I mean, what I wrote on Election Day in 2016 was that the risk to Hillary Clinton was that she would fall between the party's past and its future, that the coalition in the Rust Belt would crumble a little faster than the new coalition coalesced in the Sun Belt. And she would narrowly lose on both sides. And that is exactly what happened. I think it's pretty clear from the results this week, or last week, I guess, that the Democrats faced that risk again in 2020 to a greater extent than it looked a month before the election. And that, if Joe Biden was winning Wisconsin and Pennsylvania by this narrow a margin, I put Michigan in a different category. It's not clear to me that any other Democrat could have held it. And then on the other side, Georgia and Arizona clearly moved toward the Democrats, but it is a nail biter, and it's not even clear that they're going to hold Arizona. North Carolina, again, very close, but tilting slightly away, kind of Florida-esque almost. So yeah, I do think that it's hard for me to imagine a different candidate who could have held those Rust Belt states and or made the Sun Belt states more secure, which is kind of the teeter-totter that Democrats are on. If you pick a nominee who is perhaps better suited for turning out more younger, non-white voters and making the Sun Belt a little better, it's hard to imagine they're also going to hold just enough of those blue-collar whites in the Rust Belt. And I think that is the fundamental tension of the Electoral College, going forward, which is that for different reasons, both the Sun Belt and the Rust Belt now are very closely divided between the parties. And even if Democrats continue to win the popular vote at this incredible pace they're doing, 7 out of 8, which has never happened, the Electoral College is just at a tipping point, grueling trench warfare.
Yeah, I mean, the Rust Belt or the blue wall, it is really astonishing. So it looks like the popular vote will be a little over 4% for Biden over Trump this time. The popular vote for the House elections, if you add them all up, looks like it'll only be about plus 2% Democratic. So maybe we'll come back to that, but that suggests that Biden was able to pick off a slice of voters who weren't comfortable voting Democratic down ticket, which is, does suggest he personally added something, or maybe Trump personally subtracted something. What do you think about Trump? Is he a stronger than average Republican candidate or a weaker than average Republican candidate?
Radically different. I mean, weaker in the sense of giving up a popular vote majority almost by definition, further weakening the party and himself in the big metros, as we'll talk about, the places that are driving the economy, but astonishingly strong in Trump country. And once again, he turned out even more voters, with all of the adjustments in the polling and modeling after 2016, he again turned out more voters in his kind of Trump country than anybody expected. I mean, I look at this election as, as I've said, American politics increasingly, you can draw an imaginary beltway around every metro center, every population center in the country. And inside of it, Democrats are getting stronger, and outside of it, Republicans are getting stronger. And the story of this election is that, to me, is that Biden consolidated those metros in a way that we'll talk about to a remarkable extent. I mean, they could not have been any more emphatic in rejecting Trump, but they weren't quite as emphatic in voting Democrat down the ticket, whether it's the Senate races or especially the House races. Whereas the non-metro America, where Trump, which was equally emphatic in embracing Trump, did, I think, consolidate for Republicans up and down the ticket. So in some ways, Republican congressional candidates got the best of both worlds. They got this massive rural turnout generated by Trump, and they didn't lose quite as many of the Romney Republicans in the suburbs as Trump did. I mean, they didn't run great among those voters, don't get me wrong, but the losses were not as severe as among Trump. And I think you're going to have, I don't know, 15 House Republicans in districts that voted for Biden, which is an interesting crossover, because at the Senate level, as again, I think we'll talk about, we're going to end up for the second election in a row with virtually complete overlap between the presidential results and the Senate results. We're going to, how much did we spend on Senate races this year? Certainly over $1 billion. And it's not clear how much any of that really mattered.
We'll come back. But say a word, just is so interesting. The data on that. I mean, so what is the fact that we used to have these Senate races and people voted for their favorite senator, and it was quite separate, really, is in our living memory from the presidential vote. And now, what is the situation?
It's almost complete. It's almost completely parliamentary. I mean, if you go back as recently as Nixon or Reagan, say, Democrats won almost half the Senate seats in the states that voted both times for both Nixon and Reagan. Okay, here's where we are now. There are 20 states that we know have voted both times against Trump. Democrats now have 39 of their 40 Senate seats, every one except Susan Collins.
So in blue America,
states, who amazingly ran basically like 10 points ahead of Trump. I mean, it was astonishing. And then there are 25 states that voted both times for Trump. Republicans now have 47 of their 50 Senate seats. So you got 94% on one side, like 98% on the other. And you've got the 5 states, assuming Arizona stays in the Biden column, you've got 5 states that voted for Trump in 16 and then voted for Biden in 20. And they will decide whether Democrats have a shot at control, because they will have to win both Senate seats in Georgia, which is a really tall order. They have not elected a senator in Georgia since 2000. That was Zell Miller. The state is changing, but to win 2 Senate seats in one day to get a majority, or at least a 50-50 split, is just a reminder of how narrow a pathway Democrats have in the Senate, given how it benefits smaller rural states where Republicans are now just impregnable in their dominance.
Yeah, which I think as such, and this we probably should come back to, so I want to get back to the election for a few more minutes, but that has real implications going forward for governance, because one reason the Senate was the Senate and things could be done and you could have gangs of 8 and McCain and Feingold could work together and all this, and Dole and McGovern and all this, is that they were somewhat separated from the pure partisan divide in a sense, because they had their individual abilities to win and not be so dependent on the party, on party loyalty for their vote. And what you're saying, if 39 Democrat, as you say, is 39 out of 40 Democratic seats in the 20 states that
voted against Trump are now Democrats, and 47. Right. I mean, basically,
it's very risky to go against your own party. Then
they are being elected by voters who either support or oppose the president. That's their coalition. And it's even more than what you were saying. I think it's even deeper, is that when you had senators from states that voted the other way for president, they had an intrinsic incentive to tamp down the partisan conflict. I mean, it wasn't like they were better people. I mean, John Brewer, was, not necessarily better or worse than anybody else, but he had a need to find agreements that showed he could work with the Republican presidents that his state were voting for, and the same would be true for Hatfield, in Oregon. And now that we've completely sorted, you have basically, as I said, virtually all the senators are dispatched there by voters who either want them to support or oppose the president. And you have very few who are sent by conflicted electorates, and that just makes it intrinsically harder. I mean, Kirsten Sinema and Mark Kelly and, the Democratic senators from Georgia, if they get any, they have a reason to find a way to avoid apocalypse now. But for most of the others, and you can see that in the way that, how many Republican senators are saying that Biden won? Romney.
Romney, right.
I think maybe Murkowski. I think Murkowski did. But, you have Lindsey Graham. And that's the other thing, Bill, is that I think we have to dive in deeper to the numbers. Despite what I said, even though some of the Republicans, as we'll talk about, ran a little better in the suburbs than Trump did, by and large, they are now even more dependent on Trump country voters than they were in their last election. Because in this polarization, they are eroding in kind of the metros and they're gaining in the rurals. And in many of these states, they can survive that trade, at least for a while. But the fact is that it leaves them even more dependent on the Trump constituency. And so I think it makes it even harder for them to contemplate finding any way to, reach agreements with a President Biden. I mean, Lindsey Graham being the ultimate example of someone who was, the gang of anything, Lindsey was in. And now he is going to be a Trumpian warrior, especially if they have the majority.
And just to finish up this point, which I think is so interesting because of its implications going forward for both electoral and politics, but also legislation and governing, even on the House side, I mean, it's a little surprising given what I think you and I may have thought was going to happen, that there will be 15 or so House Republicans in Trump districts.
In Biden districts. In
Biden districts.
Yeah.
There won't be many Democrats in Trump districts, right?
No, I think most of the Democrats I think virtually all of the Democrats who lost will be in Trump districts, with the possible exception of the incumbents who lost. Most, that we know so far. I mean, I think Orange County, it's possible that the Republicans might win in seats that Biden won. Certainly some of the open seats in Texas, Biden probably won and Republicans won. I mean, I think the biggest mistake that I made, and I think this is actually a very revealing coming for the coming decade. In 2018, we saw the Democrats beat Republicans, not only in the otherwise blue metros, where you had these straggler Republicans who are holding on in the House, like in the Minneapolis suburbs or the Chicago suburbs or the Philadelphia suburbs, right? Or northern New Jersey. They extended, as we talked about at great length, they extended beyond that to places where Republicans had not previously shown weakness. So Richmond, Charleston, Atlanta, Houston, Dallas, Phoenix, Salt Lake City. And I think looking at the national polling, I and many people thought, okay, that tide is going to keep rolling. So, Democrats last time won one House seat in Houston and one House seat in Dallas. They're going to win one more in Houston and Dallas. And they are maybe going to go into Indianapolis and outside St. Louis. In other words, the suburban recoil would extend further than it did in 2018 into even more traditionally Republican suburbs, because not every suburb, is Democratic. I mean, the suburbs of Indianapolis are pretty Republican. And so I think what we saw this time was that tide kind of reached its furthest geographic extent. And that in many of those suburbs, that's where I think we are going to see districts where Biden either won or came very close and the Republicans held on. I mean, like Hamilton County, Indiana, which is the heart of the Indiana Fifth, Biden ran a lot better than Clinton did. Didn't win it though. And so, the Republican held on to that seat. And so, there are places, Georgia was not in this case. I mean, Gwinnett and Cobb moved and Democrats now have both of those House seats, but you really didn't see that very many other places. And so it's kind of the suburban, tide has come in as far as it can go. And it's kind of run up against places where the Republican DNA is too deep, even if those were Republican voters who could not vote for Trump. They were not going to vote Democrat down the ballot. And we saw this even more profoundly in state legislative races. I mean,
right.
I'm guessing
Democrats picked up no state houses.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, the Texas one was going to be the crown jewel of this election, winning the state house. It was going to be like the number 2 thing. And I'm guessing Biden won a number of the districts they had to win, and yet they didn't win them.
Yeah.
And voters were just not willing to go beyond voting against Trump. I think that points toward narrow margins in the House. The Senate division that we're talking about points toward narrow margins in the Senate. The rural urban split points toward narrow margins in the Electoral College, even if Democrats consistently win the popular vote. And it just points toward a decade of grueling trench warfare between two sides that are becoming more antagonistic, more separated, but, are not exactly even in size, but are close enough in size that either one can win.
I mean, unless things change and shake up.
Unless things change.
Or unless
Biden is the right guy for Democrats to have in here at this moment, because he at least has the potential of not further polarizing the other side and trying to, bring back just a little of it. Is there a world where Democrats can get back to losing rural areas 65-35 instead of 78-22, or 68-32 they would take at this point?
Yeah, or another way of saying it is, we just don't know whether this tide is hit the way you put it, almost, it just ran out. There's too much Republican DNA. But maybe it ran out and had a little bit of almost a setback, but can resume again, depending on the shape of the Republican Party, the shape of the Democratic Party, the shape of the Biden administration's governance. We should come back to all that, but that's why it's such an interesting moment going forward in American politics. But the point, I guess, I was just thinking as you were talking about the House districts, so there are very few senators who are from states that their own party their own presidential candidate didn't carry. And it sounds like what you're saying, and I haven't done this math, in the House, what are they? You think there are 30 House members maximum who are from districts?
I bet it's less in the end.
So let's say 25.
There were 30 Democrats in districts that Trump carried. I don't think Trump carried. I think the ones that Trump carried, they lost.
Yeah, I'm saying total on both parties. This
total, but maybe 30 at the most.
Not much. So out of 435, one way to think about this, just to help our viewers and listeners sort of conceptualize this, so in terms of the polarization and partisanship, out of 435 House members, ballpark 400 plus are in districts their presidential candidate carried, and they're sort of expected, I think one might say, by their voters to be on Team Red or Team Blue. It leaves a very small number of members who are open to the kind of deals that, again, if you want to legislate, it's not just you can have your gang of 8 in the Senate. You also need a little bit of bipartisanship in the House.
And look, there were 100 crossover districts at times in the 80s.
I think
there were 98. And even then it was hard to get much agreement across party lines. The strange thing is, I think in the Senate, if it is a 52-48 or 51-49 Republican majority, I think Biden's opportunities to make deals are going to be constrained because I think Republicans will feel like they have the opportunity to stop the thing altogether. And it's kind of hard to see maybe Medicare prescription drug negotiation, maybe some positive, carrots for green energy as opposed to sticks at fossil fuels. But I think public option, new Voting Rights Act, universal background checks, national ENDA, that it's hard to see any of that happening. On the other hand, if Democrats get to 50-50 and the train is leaving anyway, I think Biden's deal-making instincts might actually bring over. He would like Clinton, he would be willing to make substantive concessions to get a few Republican votes. So I kind of wonder if he has a better chance if he has the majority. I don't know how much. How many times are Mitt Romney or Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski going to vote with him? And how's he even going to get it on the floor? So that, I think, is a huge question going forward. Since I keep saying we'll get back to going forward, but it's so interesting. Let's just stick with it, which is, is McConnell, we are very accustomed after the 4 years of Trump and the 2 last years of Obama after the Republicans won the Senate, of Mitch McConnell being an extremely powerful Senate majority leader and holding his troops or releasing 1 or 2 senators when he didn't need them, on a couple of votes. Excuse me. I guess I'm a little doubt. I think that's, you would probably better to bet that might continue to be the case, given the general polarization and the fact that they're now used to behaving in this way. But you could also imagine, I think, on some issues, people saying, well, Biden's the president, and the Dems have the House, and I'm in for 6 more years, or even 2 more years. What do I really owe Mitch McConnell, even if he's still majority leader by, let's say, 1 or 2 seats? And I get to have a negotiation on
You'll be back to 2013. I get to have a
Yeah.
negotiation on immigration with some with John Hickenlooper and Chuck Schumer, for that matter, Democrats, and I get to, or Collins and Murkowski and Romney decide they get to vote to confirm reasonable cabinet nominees. We don't just have automatic, Republican votes against half the cabinet.
Why wouldn't Biden do what Trump did? Just acting everything. I mean, I don't think he's going to give McConnell a veto over his.
But I think McConnell couldn't. I do think on something that looks just silly. I mean, in a way, or petulant, or that they. I don't know. I say this, but what do I? That's a big question, I guess. I
think that is a big question.
I mean, a few nominees will obviously be fine. If Michelle Flournoy is nominated for the second half, she'll get, I think, 75 votes, because a lot of Republicans think it could do a lot worse, and they respect her. The question would be in a more contentious, though not sort of AOC Elizabeth Warren type nominee, does the deference to the president hold up, or do we just start routinely getting, McConnell saying that one's acceptable, that one's not, and being able to deliver 51 votes on the unacceptability of someone who's not? I think Elizabeth Warren for Secretary of Treasury, he probably could deliver 51 Republican votes against, but on someone less jarring, or
Jay Inslee for EPA.
Yeah, are they really going to go to the mat that Biden doesn't get to have a pro? Climate change a spokesman to head EPA. I mean,
assuming we find an answer to that, and which look, Trump's whole administration was acting by the end. It felt like, right. Which again is a symbol of our division. Look, to me, all of this comes back to the same reality, which is that we have two coalitions that are moving further apart, that have less overlap in what they want for the country, and which increasingly view the other as a threat to the country. And that is not all voters on each side, but it's a lot of them. It's not just the leaders. I think it's a mistake to think this is just polarization from the top down. I think there's a big chunk of each coalition that views the others' priorities and as erasing the America they believe in. And in that world, any means necessary is justified to try to stop the other. And, that's why it's incredible to see people like Huckabee and Lindsey Graham and oh, well, maybe it was stolen. That to me is kind of an indication of where this is going over the coming years. Now, maybe there are enough Americans enough Americans voted for Biden simply to lower the temperature. So it is potentially possible that some of these, if the Republicans go down that road, there will be a cost, but there just aren't that many states where that cost can be imposed. I mean, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin will be up in 2022 in the Senate. North Carolina, Florida is not really doable for Democrats. I mean, it's just they can't solve it. Texas isn't ready. I mean, they basically have to expand slightly the number of states in which they can compete for Senate seats. And that involves Georgia, it involves Arizona, it involves North Carolina. I mean, there are positive trends, for Democrats, but they've got to figure out a way to put a couple more of these states in play, as they have now Georgia and Arizona.
I mean, the slight counter argument, or at least counter suggestion, would be, that it's not just the possibility of losing to Democrats, but there was a Republican Party that was different to some degree, well, considerable degree, not just pre-Trump, but I would say pre-Obama Trump. Really, that was probably, in retrospect, when the historians write the big history, they might look at 2009 as a kind of inflection point as much as 2016, 17. I mean, whatever. Just as a electoral and congressional voting matter, I'm not making a substantive point about Trump or Obama. If Trump fades, though, on the Republican side, then we should talk about the Democrats. On the some as an ex-president. There's a big debate among all my friends and everyone about how powerful is Trump's personal hold, how powerful is the hold of Trumpism on the party, and I think there's a range of possible outcomes there, ranging from quite powerful to ex-presidents. They usually, when they try to exercise power, that's hard for them. They're kind of he in particular so much dependent on the sense that he's the one who won. He's a winner. He had the White House. He used the leverage he had in the White House. And suddenly he's another guy kind of popping off on cable TV and doesn't like someone. And maybe you get a more normal Republican Party, which isn't a liberal Republican Party. And it's not maybe even a terribly coalition friendly, bipartisan friendly Republican Party. But it would be pretty different if it's not accusing the other party of being traitors, right? That would be
a
question.
Using racist language. And I don't know exactly what role Trump personally will play, but my instinct is it's going to be bigger than smaller, mostly because of what I said, is that Republicans are even more reliant on the Trump constituency than they were 4 years ago. You know, I mean, when we talk about the election results, I mean, the results in these metros were unbelievable. I mean, how much they moved against Trump. And even though they didn't move quite as much against the Senate Republicans, it was still plenty. I mean, it was still a lot. So they are more reliant on his voters, and whether or not they worry about him, animating those voters, they have to worry about animating those voters.
Right.
I mean, and so,
well, do those voters change a little bit without Trump whipping them up?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, that's a really
do they become more quote normal Republican voters?
Right.
And that's not QAnon friendly Republican voters. Yeah. I mean, they once were. Within living lifetime, they sent people I would regard as reasonable Republicans who didn't think they had to behave like lunatics to get reelected as Republicans. And then suddenly, I don't know, they had to either keep their heads down or positively, court the crazies.
If you look at the work of political scientists like John Sides and Lynn Vavreck and Brian Schaffner, what they found in about 2016 was not that the share of Americans with anxiety or racial resentment about the way the country is changing increased. It wasn't there were more of them. It's that what Trump did was he made that more salient in their vote choice. And so people polarized around it. There used to be lots of, relatively racially conservative voters who still voted Democratic, white voters, and racially moderate white voters who still voted Republican. And what Trump did was he kind of shifted the axis a little bit so that this became the single most powerful predictor of how you would vote. And if that is the case again, which I think it will be in 2020, then it's just harder, even if Trump himself fades, which I'm sure I'm not sure he's going to. You're still in this position as a Republican that, unless you can figure out a way back into the suburbs, you're more reliant on these voters too. And that I think is the fundamental conundrum. I mean, it's not, I tweeted many times during the election, it's not just that they're scared of Trump, it's that they need the same voters.
Yeah.
I mean, he's changed everybody's coalition in the Republican Party. It's not like, with the exception of Susan Collins, it's not like somebody else ran and had a radically different coalition than he did to win.
I mean, I guess, right. And I guess the question is that change, how permanent or temporary is that change? I mean, if Marco Rubio, who's up in 2022, and there was a different Marco Rubio before Trump, I think we can agree on that. If Marco Rubio, I mean, leaving aside the matter of personal sincerity and authenticity and all that, but if Marco Rubio or others like him in other states just runs as old Marco Rubio in 2022, can he not do that? Is the pressure from the party itself, from the voters themselves, from Trumpists around him so great that he still has to sound like the Rubio of the Trump years?
Well, he's
be back to being the Rubio of the
post-election.
What's that?
In the post-election period, he hasn't changed much.
So I think you make a very good point. So the first test of this is the post-election period. Now we're only 5 days into it, and Trump is still president. So arguably 3 months from now, if now we're at 90% Trumpism in the party, 3 months from now we'll be at 70%, and maybe a year from now we'll be at 50%, or maybe not. Incidentally, maybe Tucker Carlson and Donald Jr. will be whipping up everyone, and they'll have things they don't like about the Biden administration. Even if Biden tries to be moderate, there'll be elements that people will dislike a lot on the center right.
Are there?
Right. So I don't know. That's for me a huge question, right?
Yeah. Well, let's go through it. I could ask you the question for a minute, which is, think about a couple of the big Biden agenda items. Medicare negotiating for prescription drugs. I could imagine maybe a couple of Republican senators going along with that, possibly. Expanded public option in the ACA. Any, more green dollar, billions of more in green energy, not the stick side of, ending the use of fossil fuels and generating electricity by 2030, but the carrot side, research, subsidies, 500,000 charging stations on the nation's highways, maybe, right? New Voting Rights Act, no way. HR 1, no way.
That's the political reform.
That's the omnibus political reform. Universal background checks for guns. I mean, in a McConnell Senate, it never gets to the floor. Immigration reform. There's the one. Now, what would you say? Would there be? I mean, but McConnell doesn't let it get to the floor. There's a filibuster. It doesn't happen. I mean,
I guess so. Here, I guess I just have a slightly different instinct, though. I think you have the better of the argument right now, or the better of the evidence, and I have my instinct is X number of Republican senators are going to say, A, it's the right thing to do. We can't have these dreamers just like in limbo forever. B, it's hurting us politically. There's quite a lot of evidence on that, and among a lot of voters that we look so nativist and just anti-immigrant. And if they can get some things that they can hold up for their voters as sort of not simply open borders and not simply amnesty and so forth. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. So 20 Republican senators voted for the Gang of Eight bill in 2013.
Well, 23 voted for the bill in 06, and I think it was only 13 in 13. It went down quite a bit.
No, 68 senators, I think, in 13. Oh, maybe you're right. So there were probably 50.
It was about half.
Democrats. Yes, so it was.
Connell and Hatch voted for the first one in 06.
Right.
You know, and then it eroded. Look, I mean, that's what I keep saying. They have to conclude whether all of this is hurting them politically or not. They are unquestionably trading fast-growing suburbs for stagnant small town and rural areas. But they are increasing turnout and margins in a way that they are getting more out of these places, even though the population isn't growing.
And I suppose
you have to decide. They have to decide: is that a viable long-term trade? People like Whit Ayers and Tom Davis say no. But after Cal Cunningham, after Tom Tillis won, and these other states where they won, Joni Ernst won, even though she lost the metro parts of Iowa by more. Are they going to conclude? Yeah, they say, well, yeah, eventually this runs out, but I only got to worry about it one more time or something.
Yeah, no, I think that could be, and I think even at the House level, this would be an interesting thing if I haven't looked at is, how much in a sprawling suburban/exurban district are Republican House candidates who are in a somewhat competitive district trading some of the inner suburban, what you call metro voters, for the exurban.
I think they are. I was asking somebody the other day, the Republican gerrymandering strategy in the states where they control is to create these pie-shaped districts that go from the metros out into the rural areas, and they try to submerge the suburban votes with the rural votes. And I'm betting in a lot of these seats that Republicans won, you're going to see exactly that pattern.
Yeah. So much to talk about, but I just come back in a minute to the presidential and the electoral college. Yeah. One of the things that I think has been under, in the 5 days since the election, at least, reported is, so 2012 is the same popular vote nationally as 2020, basically, +4 Democratic. In a certain way, we've had a very steady, of course, last several years, right? +4, +2 for Clinton, +4 for Biden. I mean,
maybe a little more than the end, right? Yeah, it's true.
Evenly divided, slightly lopsided for the Democrats' country, but the Republicans have that Senate advantage. But it's striking in those blue wall states. Wisconsin was +7 in 2012 and was +0.6 this time. Pennsylvania was +5.5 in 2012. It was +0.6 basically this time. Michigan was almost +10, I think 9.5. It was +2 and change maybe this time. Those blue wall states are moving Republican pretty rapidly, and are now all to the right of the country. I mean, if you told me that Wisconsin would be to the right of the nation by 3.5 points. I'm old enough to remember when Wisconsin was a pretty liberal state, and it was much more liberal than the rest of the country, than the average, than the median voter, than the median voter or whatever.
As we talked about, Trumpism and Trump is dividing the electorate along a slightly different fault line than what we saw before. And it's sort of like, if this was the line at which parties were divided, now it's like this, and it moves states. That different cut through the electorate moves states slightly to one side or the other. In a world where the electorate was divided like this, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsilvania leaned Democratic, and Ohio and Iowa leaned Democratic, and Ohio was competitive.
Ohio and Florida were the two pivot states in 2000 and 2004. These swings, perfectly mirroring the country, incidentally.
But now, in a world where Republicans are so strong among non-college and non-urban whites, the large numbers of those voters in the upper Midwest tilt all of those states further toward the Republicans. And in Ohio and Iowa, it kind of makes it decisive. In Wisconsin, that growth is offset by the enormous margins that Democrats are running up in Dane, which is Madison. Michigan, you have the combination of that suburban vote for Democrats, and also that they don't get quite as high among the blue collar whites because there's more of a union tradition in others. And then Pennsylvania is kind of the same story, where you have just enormous, absolutely enormous margins now, 275,000 votes and counting for Biden in the 4 suburban counties outside of Philly. You know, that was like 175 for Hillary and like 125 for Obama.
But since he's only winning the state by
exactly
50, ultimately means there's also a big vote outside
the other.
of,
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, you're in a world where when the line is like here, those states are just not going to be safe for Democrats.
So if Nikki Haley is the nominee, so let's just stipulate. I'm going to use Nikki
Haley versus Kamala Harris.
The idea of Nikki Haley, which is sort of Trumpy enough to hold the Trumpy people, but sane enough to hold the, you know, non-Trumpy enough to reach back into a little more into the suburban voters and so forth. I mean, you might have to favor her, right? Who the heck knows? But I mean, looking ahead, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, Michigan becomes maybe close. And,
well,
you know,
but the
electoral college, everyone's now saying, well, 306, that's pretty impressive. But suddenly 306, if you start losing Wisconsin, you're 296, and you lose Pennsylvania, you're 276, and then you're depending on what, Nevada plus Nebraska 2, or you're depending on Michigan, or you're depending on tiny margin in Georgia. I mean, how close? We're really on a knife edge, aren't we, going forward?
Yes, we are in the electoral college, because as I said when we started, you know, essentially the Democratic coalition is crumbling in the Rust Belt, and it is coalescing in the Sun Belt, but the former is happening a little faster than the latter. I mean, now it is, look, I mean, Biden did make impressive gains in Georgia. He did make impressive gains in Arizona, win or lose. And in 4 years, it'll be a little better for him in both. Something like, you know, 60% or more of the voters who turn 18 in those states every year are non-white. And you have the continued movement of, you know, white collar whites from the coasts in them. But the basic story, I think, of the next couple cycles is that neither Republicans nor Democrats can count on these Sun Belt battlegrounds or the Rust Belt battlegrounds. Leaving aside Florida, which seems pretty safe for the Republicans. Leave aside Texas, where Democrats are still a ways away. Leaving aside Ohio and Iowa, that seem pretty safe for the Republicans. If you kind of narrow in and you say Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and then North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona, you know, those will all be close. I mean, you know, who knows how close North Carolina is going to be when it's all counted. It could be really close as well. And if you're Nikki Haley and you improve in the suburbs, are you going to get this astonishing turnout in small town and rural? Probably not. Probably not going to be as good. On the other hand, you know, if it's a Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg ticket, you know, which many Democrats envisioned when they thought they were going to win Pennsylvania by 5 points. I'm not sure they envisioned it anymore. If you're going to win Pennsylvania by 3/4 of a point, you know, then you know, it's just, you know, again, in this world where you have such an enormous gulf between metro and non-metro, neither side is entirely safe on either side of the Sun Belt Rust Belt line. You could say the Sun Belt is evolving toward the Democrats, the Rust Belt is evolving away from them, but neither one is going so fast that the other side can't win, especially in 2024.
And then you've been consistent in saying the trench lines are just getting deeper and deeper. And as you say, they've pivoted a little bit, but they're still 50-50-ish in terms of the country. And therefore you expect kind of
can I give you a couple of the numbers? I mean,
please.
The Atlanta Metro, Clinton won it by roughly 480,000 votes. Biden won it by 670,000 votes. Wow. The Denver Metro, she won it by 250. He won it by about 420. The Philly Metro is about 650 to about 725 at this point, and it'll grow, you know, probably hit 750. The big 5 counties, the big 5 urban counties, even in Texas, Biden won it by 611. Clinton won it by 611. Biden won it by about 915. 300,000 more votes. He increased the margin by 50%. And by the way, in the inner suburban counties, he also did a lot better. Basically, neutralized them. You know, if you look, he flipped Duval and Pinellas, which were 2. Trump only won 13 of the 100 largest counties in America. Probably lost 4 or 5 of those that he won, depending on Maricopa. He's probably going to have lost, 90 of the 100 largest counties in America, and Miami-Dade may be the only one where he did significantly better. He lost them. The ones that he already lost, he lost by more, and then he lost a few of the new ones. I asked my friends at Brookings, who did this great analysis in 2016, as you recall, that found that Clinton only won 1/6 of the counties in the country, but her counties accounted for 2/3 of the GDP. Currently, Trump has lost 7 of the 12 counties he won that had the highest economic output. And in the other
7 more have gone to the
7
others.
more have gone the other way, assuming Maricopa holds for Biden, which I don't know if it will. And in the others, his margins were razor thin. Oklahoma City, he won by an eyelash. So basically, info age, diverse, productive, highly productive Metro America consolidated around Biden, if not necessarily Democratic down ballot candidates, as emphatically as it could. I mean, it's hard to imagine, as you're suggesting, it will stay this high in 2024. And
but
yet,
if it doesn't stay this high and there's erosion, if Biden had a unique moment where he got huge anti-Trump mobilization, plus ability to get enough
just a little more blue
voters and so forth, he gets the best of both worlds, perhaps. But it's funny that the best of both worlds for the Democrats is still such a small margin.
It's barely enough. But
now,
on the other hand,
conversely, they have a growing population, I suppose.
Right,
so it's
a growing population in the Sun Belt, especially. And look, and even in the
younger voters.
Right, millennials and Generation Z will equal boomers and older in 2024 as a share, not only of eligible voters, but of actual voters in all likelihood. And that will affect, Biden won over 60% of voters under 30, and they will be entering the electorate in bigger numbers. But having said that, I think the bigger question is, does a Nikki Haley or Marco Rubio get the rural turnout that Trump does? And on the other side, how much more can she claw back in the suburbs? Because I think she would. I don't think you would see quite the margins that you saw now. On the other hand, you wouldn't see quite the rural. Again, like the glide path from Biden to a diverse ticket in 2024 looks a little more rocky than it did before this, when even this enormous mobilization and consolidation in the metros could not make Wisconsin or Pennsylvania safe, much less Arizona. I mean, Arizona is going to be closer than people thought, even if Biden wins. Not vastly closer. People thought he was going to win by 2 or 3, and he might win by half a point. But even so, the consistent story in all of these places is that even with 77-year-old white Catholic Joe Biden on the ticket, the non-college, non-urban numbers are towering.
I mean, another way of putting this is, it seems to be both, well, I guess I'll add to this, the coalition of transformation isn't quite as smoothly coalescing as a coalition as one might have hoped. It turns out, some Hispanics weren't,
and some suburban whites in the kind of far frontier suburbs.
Weren't quite comfortable with. I mean, Trump did pick up a little bit, it seems like, or stopped the fall at least among Hispanics and among black men seems to have picked up a little. And yes, I mean that coalition maybe
it was a cultural, right. I mean, if you think about the Texas, the Rio Grande Valley, those are rural Hispanics. They're culturally conservative. Certainly in Miami-Dade, they were conservative. There's some evidence. I mean, most of the Latino analysts will say it was fine everywhere else: Arizona, Nevada, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Michigan, and all those places. There were big margins among Hispanic voters, but we'll see. I mean, it's possible there was a little erosion around the edges, and again, how far Democrats can go in cultural liberalism, and holding these voters is unclear. Republicans did not really run against what Democrats did in the House. I mean, they didn't run against Medicare negotiating on prescription drugs or things like that. They ran against what they might do. They ran against kind of the dreams of the far left of the party, which are not going to happen. A Green New Deal that bans the internal combustion engine and single payer healthcare and, defund the police. Those kinds of things are not going to happen in the House, but Republicans very effectively ran against them. I don't know how much did they run against anything that the Democrats actually passed?
Yeah, not too much.
Really?
they found individual things they said or that they co-sponsored. I guess Kamala Harris co-sponsored the Green New Deal and so forth. But
but again, those
for a while
didn't happen, right? They didn't run against.
So that's a huge question. Going forward, it's one of the biggest, and we always, contingency matters, history matters, what happens matters. There will be a Biden administration.
Yes.
And in a way, you therefore will be a little harder, for better or worse. And one could argue that one either way, right? To argue that to run against Democratic hopes, promises, threats, fanciful ideas of 4 Democratic members of Congress. And either it's again, I don't know if this is better or worse for the Democrats. They'll be running the Republicans in 2022, certainly in the off-year election, and presumably in 2024, if it's Biden or Harris as his VP succeeding him, will run against the actual Biden administration. So a huge amount depends on the success and the perceived success.
Absolutely. First of all, Bill, I came out of this thinking that Biden might have to run again in 2024. Yeah, that was my first thought out of this.
And Trump probably thinks he should run again, so we'll have a rematch.
Cleveland Benjamin Harrison thing.
Yeah, totally.
I think Biden might have to run again in 2024. I don't think I think it is conceivable that a Harris, Sherrod Brown or something could win, but the fact that the Rust Belt was so difficult, even with Biden, doesn't leave you feeling that's guaranteed at all. And again, the Sun Belt will be a little better, but it's not going to be safe by 2024. Biden describes himself as a transitional figure to a next generation of leadership. I also have viewed him as a transitional figure in terms of the coalition and the map. The Democratic future is winning Arizona and North Carolina and Georgia and maybe Texas someday, but they're not there yet. And so they need somebody who can still hold at least 2 of those 3 Rust Belt states. I mean, he might be able to survive losing Wisconsin, if you add obviously Georgia or Arizona. So I think they may need him to run again. And I agree with you that he is probably the best person they could have at this point, because his instinct is not to write off Trump country. It is to figure out how to just sand it down just a little. He didn't do much of that. He did a little bit in Erie and Lackawanna, I think, which is Scranton. But, he was in Beaver County the day before the election. It was kind of his symbol of his determination, which is a suburb of Pittsburgh, a symbol of his determination to, win back at least a little bit in that terrain. And I'm not sure how much of that happened. I haven't checked, but the last time I looked at the Beaver County numbers, flipping through my scribbles here, they were still pretty bad, and Macomb County stayed pretty bad. And Westmoreland County in Pennsylvania stayed pretty bad. Maybe there was a little improvement. The Bow counties in, around Green Bay and Wisconsin, Hillary lost them by 31. He lost them by 25. Okay. That's kind of like what it was. And I think in other places, it wasn't even that good. So he's got 4 years to try to, make some headway there.
If I were in charge of both parties, I guess what I would say is, I'd say if I were in charge of the Democratic Party, could we, you've used the term, this isn't their term exactly, but coalition of transformation, but as a sort of rhetorical matter, at least it would seem to be in their interest to appear to be a coalition of, reform and improvement, not exactly of transformation,
yes.
Reformation maybe. And on the Republican side, probably in their interest not to be a coalition of restoration, but of, I don't know what, respect.
Reformation. I mean, improving.
Yeah, conservative reformation or liberal reformation. But,
right, exactly.
But the question is within each party, and this is such an interesting question going forward, how much they just get pulled more and more away. Maybe Trump was a little bit of an aberration. Maybe Obama was a little bit of an aberration. It's not like he beat Hillary Clinton by a heck of a lot in 2008. Right. So you could imagine a sort of Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden-esque Democratic Party and a, I don't know exactly what George W. Bush, let's just say, esque Republican Party. And maybe then it's sort of neither, but I guess the internal pressures to keep going in that direction are fairly great.
If the analysis by people like Sides and Vavreck and Schaffner is right, there's a sorting between, and certainly what I've been writing and I believe is that there's been a sorting between the parties among voters who are either comfortable or uncomfortable with the way the country is changing culturally and demographically. And so each coalition is much more consistent. The Electoral College requires Democrats to either turn out a lot more of the younger non-white voters who are presumably okay with the way they themselves are changing the country in the Sun Belt, or to hold a decent number of the blue collar voters in the Rust Belt who aren't really crazy about the way the country is changing. You got to do one or the other. Hillary did not quite enough of either. Biden did just enough of both. And, you know, in 2024, if you nominate someone who entirely embodies the change, you have to win Arizona and Georgia and maybe North Carolina, because you can no longer count on Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and maybe even Michigan. Yeah. So that to me is the fundamental tension going forward. And if you're, of course, if you're the Republican Party, you know, you have to figure, are you comfortable with a world in which all the places that are adding population, driving the economy and driving economic growth are dominant for the Democrats at the presidential level, and maybe a little less dominant at the Senate level, but still leaning pretty significantly toward them? I mean, are you okay putting all of your bets on squeezing bigger margins out of places that are not growing?
Right. Short term, I mean, of course, so much depends on whether Joe Biden is, you know, presiding over a successful handling of the pandemic and a reasonable economic recovery. And, whoa, that was impressive. Or, you know, and this could happen regardless whether it's his fault or not, obviously, a severe recession, or the pandemic doesn't get, you know, handled so well, even though they do intelligent things, or God knows, foreign policy crises. But 2022, is the conventional view that presidents lose seats and their parties lose seats in the first term? I mean, any reason not to believe that? I mean, I
think Biden has the opportunity more on the pandemic than anything else, because there's a lot that he can do without Congress there. And I think it will be impossible. That's the one area where I just can't imagine how McConnell can, even if he's the majority leader, can slam the door on economic relief. I just don't.
This is a good question. So with Obama, I remember having this argument with my Democratic friends or acquaintances really in 2009. And he did, of course, the stimulus at the very beginning, and they paid a lot of attention to the economic recovery. But certainly by 2010, it all seemed to be about Obamacare. And he got an amazingly little credit, I got to say, for avoiding what looked like it could be a genuine Great Depression kind of level disaster, and having us come out of a very deep recession, financial crash that happened on a Republican watch, again, fairly or unfairly, but leave that aside. You'd think if you were running as a Democrat in 2010, you'd say, hey, Republicans, you like that feeling you had in your stomach in September 2008, or do you like where we are now? I know it's slower than you wish. I know that but they didn't have that at all. We had an Obamacare debate, and that was partly because he put that as such a priority, and Pelosi did. I guess one big question for Biden, just based on if he can get credit for the pandemic being better, or hopefully something solved because of the vaccine by 2022, that would suggest that he shouldn't be too aggressive on some of these other huge big ticket items, but he's committed to do them, right? Can he not I guess he could put forward things and not fight for them, I guess. I mean, that would be, I don't know. I mean,
as I said, I think he can be successful in the pandemic because it's been so mismanaged, and there's a lot they can do without needing congressional buy-in. And I think on the thing they do need congressional buy-in, it's going to be very hard to with all the evictions coming, for example. And
no, I think he could win that. Yeah,
I think he can win that fight. So beyond that, as I said, I don't know where Republicans are going to work with him.
But can Biden sort of make that his signature in the Democrat?
Yeah, that could be their signature for 20
years. And does that avert losing the House in 2022, or do we just get it?
Well, I think they have a risk of it because of redistricting, and the Republicans can make it a little tougher in some of these seats and states, Georgia, Florida, Texas. Maybe not Florida is probably maxed out, but Texas, maybe they can get short-term, Colin Allred and Lizzie Fletcher, make their life tougher. And Democrats will be, in the 225 range or something, 226 instead of 243. It's a very different world, gaining 7 or 8 seats, losing 8 or 10 seats. So yeah, I think it's possible they could lose the Senate, but it's a House, but it's also possible that Biden's first 2 years are less polarizing than Obama's first 2 years, especially if Republicans have the Senate. I don't think the House is going to vote immigration. I mean, especially with a narrower majority, are they going to vote all of this really polarizing stuff if there's no chance of it passing in the Senate? I don't think so. And as I said, the 2 biggest domestic items on the Biden agenda are more green dollars, carrots, not sticks, which are not as scary to people, and then expanding the public option and Medicare negotiating for prescription drugs. And, I don't think either
immigration,
of those. I think. What's that?
immigration.
And immigration, but I don't
So
think
for me that the way to, one way to,
the Senate, I don't think they're moving immigration. I don't.
Well, don't you? If Biden would accept, this is an interesting question. I just haven't thought about this before. I just can't believe that. Well, I think if Biden moved only the Dreamers, legalize the Dreamers, resolve that issue, I believe that would be hard for all Republicans or enough to oppose. The question is, from his own basis point of view, what's that?
Will McConnell let it on the floor if he's the majority?
I think so. If he's losing, if 15 Republicans say we want to be for it, and doesn't McConnell deep in his heart kind of think, let's get that out too. But can Biden afford to move legalizing the Dreamers without moving a whole bunch of other, good or bad, whatever, liberal immigration proposals at the same time? It's sort of like, he would be denounced, don't you think, by a lot of people?
He would be, but this would be the value add that Biden brings. He's going to be when Jerry Brown came back as governor, he saw himself very much as the regulator, the kind of the nozzle on the Democrat, the more liberal Democratic legislature. And I think Biden will be very comfortable in a world where he passes a solution to Dreamers and there are people on the left yelling at him. I don't think he will mind that.
So that would be interesting. So in a way, so much of the next 2-4 years is what happens within each party, right? I mean, we were talking about the Republicans before, and the Senate especially, and there are also these Republican governors. How does Ron DeSantis want to look in 2022? He in fact was not so Trumpy. Then he ran as a very Trumpy candidate. He's governed, it sounds like in practice, less Trumpy, but in rhetoric, highly Trumpy, because the Mar-a-Lago's right there and so forth, partly. I mean, how does he run for re-election? I mean, there are a lot of interesting moving parts in both parties that it seems to be not obvious right now where the incentives line up and stuff. Though,
I think a lot, Bill, I think a lot of it will depend whether people view the separation that we're talking about as the apex of the separation, or whether they view it as essentially locked in or potentially moving even further.
Right.
I mean, do you think if you're a Democrat, you can do anything to reduce these Trump country margins? And if you're a Republican, I think they're probably more confident they can do something to reduce the suburban margins without Trump.
Yeah. Let me ask you a couple of, this has been great. Let me ask you just a couple of more almost footnote questions, but interesting ones that I think people are interested in. Money in politics. What did you, it was kind of an unusual election in so many ways, the mass democratization of fundraising. I was thinking if I were working for Mike Bloomberg, and you and I know the people who work for Mike Bloomberg, and I actually personally respect them quite a lot. They told Mike, hey, $100 million in Florida. And incidentally, I was totally on board with this judgment, so I was totally wrong. Yeah. That could really make a huge difference. That state's on the knife's edge. And incidentally, we can make a lot of difference with our money for House Democrats. Yeah. Maybe they averted more defeats with House Democrats. I don't know if we have much evidence of that, but so anyway, what about money in politics?
I think, the evidence here is that the underlying cultural attachments just overwhelm money. I mean, I don't know how much money combined Cunningham, Greenfield, and Harrison spent. It may have been $500 million or something.
Unbelievable.
None of them won. Yeah. Every Senate race again went the same way as the presidential in that state, except for Maine and maybe Arizona if Trump overcomes Biden. And so I almost feel like they could have stood in bed. They could have all gone to Bermuda. Now at the presidential level, a fortune was spent in North Carolina and Trump won, and not very much was spent in Georgia, and Biden won. And one of the reasons why they liked the idea of competing in Georgia on the Biden campaign was because the ground had not been salted with tens of millions of dollars of negative ads. They kind of swooped in at the end. I don't think the money matter. I think the evidence is the money doesn't matter that much. I mean, each side, it's kind of an arms race, but is there a race that would have been differently if the funding was different? A state? I mean, I don't think so. I mean, especially the president.
I mean, as long as both parties can raise enough to not get swamped.
Exactly. Like you could not overcome the underlying partisan inclination of the states with dollars. And I would say in the future, based on where we are, if you're going to spend $200 million, you probably should spend it more on finding, registering, and turning out your voters than trying to reach swing voters with television ads. I think if you want to win Georgia, if you want to win Texas, if you want to win Arizona, and you want to win North Carolina as a Democrat, the answer is to fund Stacey Abrams and all of the Stacey Abrams-like figures in those states, because that's how you're going to win them. Unlike the Rust Belt, where most of the non-voters are blue-collar whites, in the Sun Belt, you do have large populations of young non-whites. If you can get them into the electorate, that's your best chance of establishing any breathing room in those states, because I think, again, Democrats did make gains in the suburbs there, and Mecklenburg and Wake and Durham were a lot better, and Cobb and Gwinnett were incredibly better for Democrats than they were last time. But that it doesn't go; it's not infinite, and probably their future is registering and engaging and turning out more younger non-white voters in those states.
I guess the Georgia race will be an interesting, slightly post-Trump, though not quite yet
Apocalypse
post-Trump.
now.
January 5th. What's that?
It's apocalypse now. I mean,
yeah.
You know,
but I think it's an interesting question for Purdue. I think it gets to the point you were making earlier about, well, so far the Republicans aren't showing much separation from Trump. Do Purdue and Loeffler run as just pure Trump Republicans in a runoff where they need to mobilize Trump Republicans to vote in Georgia, which you won virtually half the electorate, obviously. But they do need some like Atlanta suburbanites and business types who are not going to be comfortable with the kind of, yes, don't never concede the election, President Trump. And I welcome my new colleague from elsewhere in Georgia, who's a QAnon supporter, whatever her name is.
I don't know how she undoes, I don't know how she unrings that bell. I mean, I think for a lot of reasons, I could imagine Warnock being a favorite over Loeffler. People would feel good about voting for an African-American senator. She has undistinguished herself. I mean, she is just—
She's never won an election. So.
Right, yeah, from, you know, elected senators don't do very well, as Martha McSally has managed to lose
appointed
senators. She's got scandal issues, the QAnon. I could see Warnock being a favorite. I think the other one is really hard for Democrats because at that point, you know, Purdue is kind of more of a standard issue Republicans, even if he descended and kind of disgraced himself with Trumpian racism in the way he, you know, mocked Kamala Harris's name. I thought that was really a low point of the whole campaign, maybe, you know, but at that point, you're asking voters in suburban Georgia to basically make Chuck Schumer the majority leader.
Yeah.
And are there enough voters who might say, well, I feel good about electing Warnock, but I don't really want to elect Chuck Schumer? That's going to be the challenge, I think. And Democrats are going to have to massively turn out, you know, African-American voters, I think, to have a shot here, and the Latino voters as well.
But it'll be interesting to see the rhetoric, I would just say, of the both campaigns. It'll mostly just be standard, I suppose, you know, but continuation, but sort of how Trumpy the Republicans are, how woke, if at all, the Democrats are. You know, it's sort of been
not very woke, I don't think.
You think, yeah, well, there's certainly be warned against it, but it was striking how much, for all the talk of, I mean, I've been much more focused on the Republicans, I guess, for obvious reasons, but it is striking that we're only 5 days after an election, which Biden won, and they lost a few House seats, but they, you know, and fell short in the Senate, but they still control the House and the presidency. That's not nothing, you know. And they're already Abigail Spanberger's yelling at Pelosi on phone calls, and AOC's in some fight with some other Democrat with Clyburn, and I mean, makes you wonder about these coalitions. Are a little more rickety than perhaps.
Well, I think this level of division in the country puts enormous strain on each coalition, because if you, as I said, in the Senate, other than Susan Collins, nobody had their own coalition different from the presidential candidate in their state.
Right.
So if you're uncomfortable in a world where you're utterly dependent on Trump voters and you're losing the suburban business Republicans who you used to count on, you know, that's not entirely comfortable. And then if you're in a district where if you're as a Democrat, you have to win some of those voters, and they're running against not what you actually voted for, but what, you know, some of your colleagues are holding up as their wish list. That's not really comfortable either. I mean, it's, again, but like Biden could be Jerry Brown when he came back. Right. First time around, it was kind of a mess.
So explain, for those of us who aren't California or California centric as you are, and think that everything that happens out there, we're all living and dying with, whether it's rock music.
And it was a while ago. So Jerry Brown, you know, when he was governor in the 70s, and very ambitious, creative, but totally unfocused and, you know, chaotic and all over the place.
Runs for president a couple of times.
Run for president a couple of times. You know, Mike Royko calls him Governor Moonbeam. He did a lot of good things, but he was kind of a mess. He comes back 28 years later in 2010, right? 28 years later, he wins after his first
having left the governorship in 1982.
1982, he loses the Senate race to Pete Wilson. He goes off in the wilderness. He runs for president in 92 against Clinton, doesn't win. And then he starts from the bottom. He starts a commune in Oakland. He gets elected mayor in Oakland 2 terms. He gets elected attorney general like his father in 2006 at the state. And then in 2010, he gets elected governor again. And then in 2014, he gets elected governor again. And in the second iteration, everybody, he gets rave reviews from all over the country. And he very much views himself as kind of the regulator or the faucet on this very liberal Democratic majority in Congress, that he basically says, not so much, or okay, and the business community feels like it can deal with him. The left doesn't hate him because they're getting climate stuff and other things that they care about. And that's probably, Biden is probably really happy that in that environment. He may be happier in that environment than he is kind of holding on to a train, of left ideas that are, motoring along at 160 miles an hour. If he had a 50-50, I don't think he wants a McConnell Senate, but if he had a 50-50 Senate and a narrow majority in the House, and you could do bread and butter things that Democrats care about, and you could do some voting reform, and you could do some police reform, but you can't go to the max. Don't you think that that's a world that Biden would be pretty comfortable in?
I mean, I guess just to think through the analogy, Brown was helped by having huge Democratic majorities in both chambers, which he could then both depend on for some things and check.
Yes.
The McConnell, Biden, it's just such a complicated situation now to get in Washington. So you've got your McConnell stopping you here, but then you've got your own base pushing you there. And so the triangulation that Biden has to engage in is maybe a little more complicated than what you're.
But also simple in the sense that if McConnell has the Senate, Biden's going to get minimal legislative accomplishments. I just don't think there's any way in which this Republican Party, that 5 days after the election, Lindsey Graham is bellowing about fraud. And as I said, the senators are even more dependent on Trump country for their own internal survival. I don't see them working with him on very much at all. I think there'd be a few exceptions, as we said, coronavirus relief, maybe Medicare prescription drug, but not many.
I'm willing to take a slight contrarian position on that, but I would need a lot of odds if we're going to bet on it. So, since I think you're certainly more in accord with recent history and probably with the probabilities. Final sort of just point, the polls were off, and then you and I were chatting, and you were actually quite skeptical of the exit poll as well. Say a word about why the polls were off, and then also what should people going forward, look up online to actually find out, apart from reading your articles, obviously, find out what happened.
Yeah. Well, the polls were off in the Rust Belt again, more than in the Sun Belt. I don't think they were vastly. North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Texas may have been a little better for Trump, although probably poll average was like 4 and he won by like 6. The basic thing in Texas was that the polls missed the Hispanic movement. But I think the Sun Belt polls were pretty close. They all had dead heats, and we kind of got dead heats.
Florida was a little off, but that also missed the.
Florida was a little, again, for the same reason, that the Hispanic number was even worse than people thought. But the Rust Belt polls, clearly Trump's ability to change the electorate in those states, including Ohio and Iowa, all 5 states, polls had it much closer than it was, or better for Democrats than it was. And it seems to be the same thing again, that he is able to bring in more of those non-college, non-urban whites than pollsters can measure. And I don't know what the answer is for that, because they certainly made a lot of changes trying to answer that this time. The exit poll is kind of difficult to understand for the opposite reason. They made important changes in methodology in 2018 to try to produce, the problem with the exit poll historically was that it overestimated the share of college whites and underestimated the share of non-college whites. And they made changes in 2018 that seemed to resolve that. And then they came back in 2020 with an exit poll that was, I think, 34% non-college whites, 31% college whites, and 35% non-whites. And that's very hard to believe, just very hard to believe looking at the vote totals. Non-college whites were probably somewhere around 42% of the voters. Jeez. And the college whites were probably, probably right around 30, and the non-whites were probably 30 or 31.
So an exit poll that's missing the number of non-college whites by 8%.
Then it gets the vote wrong too, because
it gets the vote wrong. That's a pretty big miss, right?
Right, it's a pretty big miss. And so they to add the vote up, they have too many college whites voting for Trump. It's not plausible that Trump split college whites when he lost Denver and Austin and Philadelphia and Madison and Minneapolis by the margins that we're talking about. It's just not
the metro areas. Yeah,
metro areas.
Yeah.
And so if you look at the AP vote scan, they're in the 40s for the non-college whites, and thus they have Biden winning the college whites by about 6 or 7 or 8 points or something like that, which seems to me much more plausible. Still not as much as it looked like before, by the way. I mean, I think before the election, you would have said he would have gotten to 56% or so, 55, 56 probably among college whites. He may have gotten to 52 or 53. And that reflects what we were talking about before, which is that once this kind of recoil from Trump hit the suburbs that were historically even more Republican, it kind of lost, it didn't roll through as powerfully as it did in Philly suburbs, like the WOW counties that everybody talks about, the big three suburban counties outside of Milwaukee, which are the most Republican of any suburban counties in the North. They're almost all white. Biden lost them by 7,000 votes less than Clinton did. A little better, but not the 100,000 vote shift that you see in the Philly suburbs. And that's kind of the story. I think he did better in Collin and Denton in Texas, but he didn't win them. He kind of neutralized them. So I think
and the AP Votecast is like accessible to normal people?
It is. People can find it on the NPR website, among other places. A lot of people use it. Fox uses it.
Yeah.
The NPR uses it.
Well,
and I'm betting they adjust the exit polls, because the state level exit polls make a hell of a lot more sense. If you look at a state like Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, those numbers make sense. I mean, you have Biden in the high 50s among college whites, and Trump, still right over, right around the high 50s to low 60s among non-college whites, which very much accords with the pre-election polling, just a slight tilt further toward Trump. I don't know what to make of that national exit poll.
Interesting. It's funny, just to wrap up, everyone knows that 77,000 votes in 3 states.
Right. Biden will win them by more.
Well, won it for Trump in 2016, and of course he lost the popular vote, so it's even more startling that it's an inside straight. Biden won the popular vote by 4+ points, so it's not quite really.
Right. And he'll also win those states by more than Trump did.
No, but if you look at the 3 states he needs to go over, it's less. This is Gary Kasparov. I want to give credit where credit's due. Pointed this out to me in a phone call this morning, and I haven't double checked the math, and maybe I'm slightly wrong, but I think if you add up, the closest states are Arizona, assuming he wins it, Georgia, and Wisconsin.
Right.
And he wins those 3 by a total of 55,000 votes, less than 77. And if he doesn't,
that's not the right comparison, because he goes over with Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. He doesn't need
No, but you got to take Wisconsin out, because Wisconsin's only 20,000 votes.
Well, yeah, but I'm saying, I don't know why you.
So give him Michigan and Pennsylvania. All the next states that put him over are unbelievably close.
Wisconsin's the state that put him over. I mean, if Michigan,
right, so that's 20,000 votes. That's what I'm saying.
No, but what I'm saying is,
you're saying.
If you had it Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, it's a lot more than Trump's margin.
No, sure, that's absolutely right. But he's still his tipping point state. Let me just make it more simply that
was Wisconsin.
Tipping point state in 2016 was
Michigan, I guess.
Yeah, Michigan. Well, Trump only needed 1 of those 3, right, or 2 of those 3. Well, wait, I know what's getting to. But this time, it's a little closer than people realize in the electoral college.
It was close. I mean, that's where we started.
Wisconsin was the tipping point state. That's 20,000. Georgia's 10,000. Arizona's going to be, I don't know what, 10,000, 5,000. It's going to be very, very low.
Right.
That is a little bigger, but it's fewer electoral votes.
You can kind of end where we started, right? I mean, Hillary Clinton she fell in between the party's past and its future. She fell just short in the Rust Belt as the coalition crumbled. She fell just short in the Sun Belt as the coalition didn't come together. Biden, succeeded just barely on both fronts,
right?
With the exception of Michigan, which was pretty substantial. He succeeded barely on both fronts, and you have to ask whether anybody could have won, and depending on how this administration goes, whether anybody can do both in 2024. I mean, you can imagine a Kamala Harris ticket, taking Georgia, taking Arizona, maybe finding a way to win North Carolina. But boy, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin looks awful tough without a 77-year-old white guy on the top of the ticket.
And then we're back at an unbelievably close electoral college math.
I think we are in a world where, even though the Democrats keep winning the popular vote, and in that sense their coalition is clearly bigger and growing, the electoral college, the Senate, and even the House are all going to stay really close for a while. And the challenge is that they're not close because there are a lot of swing districts. They're close because there are a lot of just utterly incompatible states and districts that happen to add up to about the same amount.
Yeah, well, hopefully, I say as someone who does not think ultimately this kind of trench warfare is very healthy for the country. Maybe now that we're all agreed that that's the situation, it'll, of course, everything will reverse. Someone will win, pick up 76 House seats in 2022, or win a 400 electoral college votes in 2020. It's
Anybody
amazing.
was going to win 400 electoral college votes, it was going to be Biden with 225,000 people dead. And,
Right.
the pandemic roaring through everywhere. And it just, the stickiness of this system really kind of came through this year.
Yeah, that's what struck me. I mean, I'm anti-Trump, so maybe I was a little biased and not doing justice here to the arguments that led people who were not happy with this management of the pandemic and are not, of course, racist or bigoted, and still felt they should vote for Trump, certainly felt they should vote Republican down ticket. But the fact that they stuck with Trump, that's actually there is that very important 2%, very important from the point of view of those of us who were in Republican voters against Trump and so forth.
And clearly,
that switched from Trump to the Republicans. The switch from wouldn't go with Trump, but stuck with Republicans down ticket. Having said that, at the end of the day, in the two-party vote, this is another way to think about it, Biden-Trump is 51-49.
Yeah.
Right. So
look, I think the efforts of groups like all the groups that focused on peeling away a sliver of Republicans, clearly, I mean, you have to, if you look at the Senate and the House results, it contributed. Now, Trump obviously contributed by making himself so unacceptable to voters, but all of that work mattered,
But I mean, the degree.
And so did the mobilization. I mean, Blue America did everything it possibly could, and it was barely enough, right? The money, the celebrities, all of the efforts by groups and so forth, and it was just barely enough.
And do you think Democrats would agree with what you've just said and say, yeah, we need to really think through how to manage things both politically and substantively in Congress, in the Biden administration, maybe state houses if they have them, because it really was a close run thing? Or are they in a little bit of, we doubled Hillary's margin from 2 to 4%. At the end of the day, Biden got, more electoral votes. It was better than it looked on Tuesday night. It's a little more like 2018 than you think. There's a West Coast vote will come in and the popular vote number will creep up another half point or so. And where are Democrats right now, do you think, in their heads?
I think they're more in the chastened than in the, inspired. I think that, given the scale of the effort at every dimension, from the presidential to the Senate to the House, the fact that Biden won, yes, comfortably in the popular vote, and the popular vote margin is expanding, and Republicans have to be worried about what that implies, but that the electoral, the states that decided were so razor close, closer than they expected, except for Michigan maybe, and even Michigan was probably closer than they expected. I think they have to be chastened, and they face the fundamental choice. I mean, do you pursue an agenda and a persona that's designed to further turn out and excite the coalitions moving in your direction, the constituencies moving in your direction, the younger non-white voters, the college whites in the suburbs? Or do you really figure out a way that, you say we cannot let the non-urban parts of America become 3 to 1, 4 to 1. Sherry Bustos, the chair of the DCCC, almost lost, and it may not be possible against a kind of Trumpian appeal to kind of racial identity and cultural identity. And the Democrats want to fundamentally change America and tear down everything you have believed in your whole life. There may be no answer to that in small town and rural America. But I would say Democrats got to look for one.
Yeah. And I do think governing makes it both easier and harder, in the sense that he will govern. He will do what he does. He either will or won't, impose cancel culture everywhere. He either will or won't nationalize, socialize healthcare. He either will or won't raise taxes, to destroy the private sector, or just have a small tax increase on the wealthy, basically. So I think in one hand, you might say that reality could help the Democrats. On the other hand, he has to govern in a very difficult situation, and a lot of things can go wrong when you try to govern. So that could hurt the Democrats.
Yes, if your goal is to govern in a way that allows you to make further inroads in non-urban America, a narrow margin chastened Democratic Party is a good thing. But that's different than a McConnell Senate that means you don't do anything. Or virtually nothing.
Yeah, that's the challenge for everyone. But then on the other hand, if the Republicans look, well, whatever, this will go on, and we should go. We will go on, and we will come back and go on in a year or so, maybe less, to see where we stand. But this has been extremely illuminating, raised maybe more questions than we answered, but that's appropriate given the moment we're in, right?
Yeah, the results did. I think the results raised more questions than they answered, actually. I agree with you.
That's a good thing to close on. So, Ron Brownstein, thanks very much for joining me on Conversations. It was, as always, very illuminating.
Great, Bill.
Thanks, Ron, and thank you for joining us on Conversations.